But either way, you know, Eric picks her up as a prostitute here. The inspector says, you went with her to her lodgings that night. Her lodgings is where she lives. Eric says, yes, I insisted, it seems. I'm not very clear about it. But afterwards she told me she didn't want me to go in, but that, well, I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty and I threatened to make a row. Now, this is a very, very important but sensitive part, really, of the play. Eric didn't want to take no for an answer. So Eric went back to Eva Smith, or walked her back home. Eva Smith didn't want him to go in her house, but he says he insisted, and whilst he's not very clear, he can't really remember it, she said she didn't want him to go in, i.e. she didn't want to sleep with him. But he says, I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty and I threatened to make a row. So he most certainly pressurised her into having sex with him that night. Now, you have to be very careful when you write, or if you chose to write about this in an exam, particularly if you're going to make a statement like Eric rapes Eva Smith. Now, if we were in a classroom right now, we would be having a very important conversation about consent right now, because every time I do this play year on year, it is always a very important time to bring it up. By our modern standards, I would hope that we would think that what Eric does right now could most definitely be constituted as Eva Smith not giving her consent. But Priestley leaves it very, very ambiguous here. And what we've got to remember is, despite Priestley being an advocate for women's rights, times were different then. So I would just be very, very wary about making a blanket statement like Eric raped Eva Smith. He certainly pressurises her into sleeping with him. Okay, so it's just a very, it's a very sensitive part of the play that we need to deal with sort of appropriately. So he definitely pressurises her into having sex with him. So the inspector says, so she let you in? And Eric says, yes, and that's when it happened. And I didn't even remember. That's the hellish thing. So he can't even remember. Oh, my God, how stupid it is. And Mrs. Burling says with a cry, oh, Eric, how could you? So she's very upset by this. And this would be very shocking for a mother to hear about her son. And Burling says sharply, Sheila, take your mother along to the drawing room. So they're getting rid of the women, basically, which again is pretty misogynistic, considering what they're talking about is the way Eric, their brother or their son, has treated this woman. But still, so they're getting rid of the women so they can talk about the gory details, really. Sheila protests, says, but I want to. But Burling says very sharply, you heard what I said. Gentler, go on, Sybil. So Burling says very sharply, you heard what I said, and then go on, Sybil. So he goes to open the door while Sheila takes her mother out, then he closes it and comes in. So the inspector says, when did you meet her again? Eric says about a fortnight afterwards, so he sees her about 2 weeks later. The inspector says, by appointment, so did you arrange to see each other? And Eric says no. So they just happened to bump into each other. Okay, so they bumped into each other, or met by accident. He said, and I couldn't remember her name or where she lived. It was all very vague, but I happened to see her again in the palace. So the inspector says, more drinks? And Eric says, yes, I thought, though that time I wasn't so bad. The inspector says, but you took her home again? And Eric says, yes, and this time we talked a bit. She told me something about herself and I talked too. Told her my name and what I did. So she knows a little bit about him. The inspector says, and you made love again? And Eric says, yes. I wasn't in love with her or anything, but I liked her. She was pretty and a good sport. So their relationship is different to Gerald's. you know, Gerald was like a girlfriend. There was emotion there. You know, Eric's relationship with her is physical. You know, there's no sort of a romantic relationship going on there. And Burling says harshly, so you had to go to bed with her. And Eric says, well, I'm old enough to be married, aren't I? And I'm not married. And I hate these fat old tarts around the town. The ones I see some of your respectable friends with. So this is, again, you know, Priestley exposing the hypocrisy of the rich. You know, they pretend to be good people, but they're the ones out sleeping with prostitutes. Burling says angrily, I don't want any of that talk from you. The inspector says very sharply, and I don't want any of it from either of you. Settle it afterwards. So he says to Eric, did you arrange to see each other after that? And Eric says yes, and the next time or the time after that, she told me she thought she was going to have a baby. She wasn't quite sure, and then she was. So you can imagine what a massive shock that would have been to Eric. The inspector says, and of course she was very worried about it. And Eric says, yes, and so was I. I was in a hell of a state about it. Now this could link to his behaviour at the start of the play. Remember, she only went to Mrs. Burling 2 weeks ago. So maybe, you know, worried that he's impregnated this girl, has been behaving some of his shady, evasive behaviour earlier on in the play. The inspector said, did she suggest that you ought to marry her? Now that might seem a bit strange, you know, get a girl accidentally pregnant and then you've got to marry her. But this would have been the expectation. Had Eva been of a similar class, although it was very unlikely they would have slept together had she been of a similar class, because obviously a woman of that class wouldn't be in that position, it would be expected that he would automatically marry her for the sake of both their reputation. But obviously with her lower social class, the fact that she is, you know, a member of the poor, of the working class, would make that marriage be an issue. But still, in terms of the laws of society or the rules of society, Eric should have been made to marry her. But Eric says, no, she didn't want me to marry her, said I didn't love her and all that. In a way, she treated me as if I were a kid, even though I was nearly as old as she was. So what's interesting is Eva could have forced Eric to marry her, but she didn't, because she was thinking of him as well. So she wasn't just thinking of herself, she was thinking of Eric and how awful it would be for them to actually be married and be together, particularly with the differences of their social class and the fact that they don't love each other. So the inspector says, well, what did you propose to do? And he said, well, she hadn't a job and didn't feel like trying again for one, and she'd no money left. So I insisted on giving her enough money to keep her going until she refused to take any more. So he tried, so she had no money, and he insisted on giving her some money to keep her going. So the inspector says, how much did you give her altogether? And Eric says, I suppose £50 all told. Now this would have been more like, you know, hundreds of pounds, so a lot of money. Burling says, £50 on top of drinking and going around the town? Where did you get £50 from? As Eric does not reply, the inspector says, that's my question too. And Eric says miserably, I got it from the office. Burling says, my office? Eric says, yes. And the inspector says, you mean you stole the money? So Burling says, my office? Eric says, yes. The inspector says, you mean you stole the money? So, you know, we need to remember that this is a crime. Eric has committed a crime. It may be against his own father, but he's still broken the law. And Eric says, not really. Burling says angrily, what do you mean, not really? Eric does not reply now because Mrs. Burling and Sheila come back. And Sheila says, this isn't my fault. Mrs. Burling says to her husband, I'm sorry, Arthur, but I simply couldn't stay in there. I had to know what's happening. And Burling says savagely, so he's very cross, well, I can tell you what's happening. He's admitted he was responsible for the girl's condition, and now he's telling us he supplied her with money he stole from the office. And Mrs. Burling, even still, is shocked. Eric, you stole money? He says, no, not really. I intended to pay it back. And Burling says, we've heard that story before. How could you have paid it back? And Eric said, I'd have managed somehow. I had to have some money. And Burling says, I don't understand how you could take as much as that out of the office without somebody knowing. And Eric says, there were some small accounts to collect, and I asked for cash. Burling says, gave the firm's receipt and then kept the money, eh? And Eric says, yes. So basically, Eric went and got the money from some of the customers and then just basically pocketed the cash rather than giving it to the sort of accountant to be included in the company's takings. Burling says, you must give me a list of these accounts. I've got to cover this up as soon as I can. So we can see that this is Mr. Burling's priority. He doesn't seem particularly upset that he's ruined the life of a working class girl. He's got to cover up the scandal. You damned fool. Why didn't you come to me when you found yourself in this mess? So Mr. Burling's like, well, if you needed money, why didn't you just come to me? And Eric says, because you're not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble. That's why. Now that's really important. They don't have a close relationship. He didn't feel comfortable enough with his father that he could go to him when he was in trouble. And Burling says angrily, don't talk to me like that. Your trouble is you've been spoilt. The inspector says, and my trouble is I haven't much time. You'll be able to divide the responsibility between you when I'm gone, which is, of course, the important thing that this play is about responsibility. He says to Eric, I've just one question, that's all. The girl discovered that this money you were giving her was stolen, didn't she? And Eric says miserably, yes, that was the worst of all. She wouldn't take any more, and she didn't want to see me again. He says in a sudden, startled tone, here, but how did you know that? Did she tell you? The inspector says, no, she told me nothing. I never spoke to her. And Sheila says, she told Mother. Because remember, Eric has no idea of Mrs. Burling's involvement. And Mrs. Burling's alarmed. Sheila! And Sheila says, well, he has to know. And Eric says to Mrs. Burling, she told you. Did she come here? But then she couldn't have done. She didn't even know where I lived. What happened? Mrs. Burling is distressed and shakes her head but does not reply. And Eric says, come on, don't look like that. Tell me what happened. The inspector says with calm authority, not clam authority, I'll tell you, she went to your mother's committee for help after she'd done with you. Your mother refused that help. So Eric says, nearly at breaking point. So he is incredibly angry and upset. Then you killed her. She came to you to protect me. And you turned her away. Yes, you killed her. And the child she'd have too. My child, your own grandchild. You killed them both. Damn you, damn you.
Mum, can we have your phone?
Can you leave Mummy alone?
Mum's taking her phone.
Sorry, Year 10s, I'm being interrupted by my children. I'm now bribing them with my mobile phone to go away. Which has worked. The joys of trying to teach at home and look after 2 children under 7. Anyway, Eric is nearly at breaking point. He blames his mother for the death of the mother of his child and, of course, the child herself. So, these are really harsh words. You killed your own grandchild. So he blames Mrs. Burling. And Mrs. Burling, again, very distressed now. No, Eric, please, I didn't know. I didn't understand. So he's almost threatening her. So he's so angry. He's almost, not quite, getting physical. You don't understand anything. You never did. You never even tried. Now this is really interesting because you could look at this in a wider context. Mrs. Burling doesn't understand anything. You know, that's how we've been presented. That's how she's been presented. She doesn't understand anything. She is so convinced of her superiority and her elitism that she always thinks she's right. Sheila is frightened of Eric. No, don't. And Burling is furious and intervening. Why, you hysterical young fool? Get back or I'll... And then the inspector, taking charge, masterfully yells, stop. And they're all suddenly quiet, staring at him, which is where we're going to stop. Now, this is important because it shows, hysterical young fool, shows how Mr. Burling views his son. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop there. So, what I would like you to do now is, using what we've learned today, I would like you to write a summary of what Eric did to Eva Smith and how he treated her, as well as writing an explanation of how it develops your impression of his character. So firstly, write a summary. What did Eric do to Eva Smith and how did he treat her? And then write an explanation of how it develops your impression of Eric's character. Okay? Now remember, you don't need to send these to me. What you do need to send to me is the work that is set for tomorrow. Now all of this will be put in a more detailed email, but what you will see attached to the email for this link is a Word document. And on this Word document is an extract. The extract begins with when Burling was asking why Eric doesn't come to him. And Eric says, because you're not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble, that's why. And it ends with the inspector taking charge masterfully and says, stop. So on this Word document is this extract and the question, how is Eric presented in the extract? So what I'm going to ask you to do in your independent lesson tomorrow is I'm going to ask you to use that resource. Again, you can print it out if you have access to a printer. If not, you can just have it up on your screen. I want you to read through the extract, which is what we've just read here. I would like you to identify 3 to 6 short quotations that give you an impression of Eric's character. If you're someone that's less confident with your mini P writing or a slower writer, you might want to pick 3 quotations. If you're someone that's more confident or a quicker writer, you want to pick 5 or 6. So you need to think and annotate, how do those quotations give you an impression of Eric's character? And then give yourself 20 minutes, like you'll get in the exam, to write an extract analysis of how Eric is presented. So all of that information is on the Word document. There's an example of a structure. There's also a model mini PE as well to help you get started. But if you need any help, email your class teacher. So today, you're to complete these 2 tasks here. Tomorrow, you're to complete the extract analysis, which is attached to the email you received today. Once you have completed that extract analysis, can you either take a photo or, if you've typed it, email it to your class teacher. Okay, so after you've completed the extract analysis tomorrow, you email that extract analysis to your teacher and we will mark it for you. But if you need any help or any additional support with that, please let us know. Okay, so that's it for this week. We look forward to hearing from you tomorrow once you've completed the extract analysis, and it's goodbye for now.